at the beginning, at the end of the movie, to make
Okay, that's sort of the
general
umbrella.
view,
Okay,
to position the subject,
Okay.
and all these kind of things.
All
And
right.
of course, then also, I would like to know more specifically what ILO does.
sure, exactly.
But it goes more for unemployment. Why do we have this situation right now?
Yes.
etc. So
Okay.
it's a,
And do you want longer answers or shorter answers? How would you prefer it? Conversational or we see how we go?
what?
Short without leaving the important things out would be good.
That's very helpful.
No, but actually short and normally is better.
Shorter, that's
Normally.
that's certainly the case normally. Yeah.
Ok, comme ça?
Ouais, c'est bon.
C'est bon?
C'est bon?
Okay. Mr. Ryder, first of all, thank you very much that you are willing to participate in our movie. I think it is not normal that you're spending your time. I know everybody's busy and so on, and then comes a little guy from Switzerland who wants to make a movie. The movie is going to be shown probably on TV, on cinemas, and I'm going to tour also.
Yeah.
And the goal why I do that is because I was for 5 years at the Secretary of State in Bern, and I'm also responsible for labor. And many of the things I was responsible for, I realized that the broader population do not know.
Yeah.
And this is why I make this movie, and it's completely financed by myself. Nobody else can interfere. So if you have any things which you are not happy with,
I come to talk to you.
You have to talk to me.
Okay.
So first of all, I chose the topic unemployment because I think unemployment is one of the most important topics which we have on politics worldwide right now. Do you share this view?
I absolutely do. I think that the global unemployment crisis is a top priority. We have today over 200 million people in the global economy who have no access to a job. And perhaps the most critical area of the problem is young people. If you're under 25 years old, you're 2 or even 3 times more likely to be unemployed than other adults. So yes, it's a top international crisis. All regions are affected, and I think that international policymakers should be focusing very, very sharply on this problem.
But if you're comparing, you say 200 million, we have a population of close to 8 billion. It's not so dramatic, is it?
You're right. I think you have to look beyond the open unemployment figures. Now, I just mentioned youth unemployment. If we think that not so far from here in Switzerland, in Greece, in Spain, more than 50% of young people don't have a job. If you're Greek and young, you're more likely to be unemployed than employed. So there are real situations where I think crisis is the only applicable word. But we do need, you're quite right, to look beyond open unemployment. If you go to Africa, if you go to South Asia, it doesn't make so much sense to talk about the unemployment crisis. When you don't have social security, when you don't have social protection, being unemployed is not an option. You have to work, but you work in the informal economy. You suffer from grave underemployment, low productivity, unsafe conditions. And so if you go to India, as you know, or if you go to Africa, you'll find 80% of people working in informal conditions. Even in Latin America, it's nearly 50%. So you're right, unemployment is one thing, underemployment and informality is another. We need to look at both of those things.
One of the reasons why I chose that subject was that I was afraid about the figures of Spain. We went to Spain. Well, not so easy to find unemployed. Is it a question of culture, how you handle unemployment? How important is the element culture on saying unemployment is a terrible thing or you can live with it?
Well, I think if you go to Spain, it's a country I know very well, you have to be surprised sometimes that a country like Spain is able to survive, to continue, with over 50% of its young people, over 20% of its adults out of work. And the answer, of course, of why Spain continues is because you're right. There is a strong culture of solidarity, family solidarity, community solidarity. That's what keeps unemployed people, young people going in Spain. But if you go back to the economics is the same in Spain or Portugal or Greece as it is for the rest of us. And what you have in Spain is a dramatic problem of structural and cyclical unemployment. We've seen very, very severe austerity programs applied in these countries. None of us should be surprised that this has produced mass unemployment. I think the question now for Spain is, as the economy begins to grow a little bit, whether or not this can have an impact on labour markets. We're seeing the beginnings, but it's the beginning of a very long path back towards something like full employment.
When we were in Spain, we interviewed a lot of unemployed people. And almost all of them said, I am not expecting anything from the government to help me out. What is the role of a government, of a national government? What is the role of the international community?
Well, I think the first thing you talk about is very important. One of the consequences of this crisis since 2007, 2008, we've lost 62 million jobs around the world because of the crisis. The conclusion people have drawn from that is that governments, politicians are not able to control the global economy. They cannot deliver jobs. And there is this loss of confidence. Now, whether that is misplaced or an accurate assumption is for others to judge. But the point is that it is for governments to act together to bring jobs back to communities. When the crisis broke, I remember many people said, this is the moment for the state to come back, that too much had been left to market forces and the state had to reassert its authority. I think you saw in the early years of the crisis, we set up the G20, this ad hoc grouping to cope with the financial crisis. I think you've seen greater understanding that governments must act individually and collectively to counter the crisis. Of course, they have to work with private actors as well, but governments bear a very heavy responsibility in overcoming the jobs crisis.
My feeling is that governments, national governments, want to solve the problem by themselves, and they are not so much interested in the international or global picture. My fear is that these issues of fighting unemployment is an instrument also for re-election. And therefore we are not really moving forward, we are not taking the right measures. It's maybe delicate for you to answer,
Well,
but
yeah, you're right. Politics plays a big part in this story. It was Mr. Juncker, the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who said, all of us, politicians, we know what we have to do to overcome the crisis, but we don't know how to get elected after we do it. So politics is a major feature. Now, you say that governments respond basically to national interests, and of course you're quite right. We've seen it in Europe, trying to deal with the euro crisis. It's not been 28 countries acting all together. It's been different combinations of government acting in different ways according to national interests. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, there is a realization, and it's somewhat in conflict with that we do need regional and international action to get out of a crisis which by its very nature is global. Now the G20, which I've mentioned already, recently set itself a target. The finance ministers of the G20 said, look, we have to act together to ensure that the economy increases its growth by 2 percentage points above its existing trajectory to create jobs. And they know that an individual government can't do it by itself. They have to act together. National politics can put obstacles in the way of that, but it doesn't detract from the fact that this is really needed. And the ILO is one place where that international cooperation can be promoted.
But growth of the economy, that's of course an undisputed goal, I think, worldwide. But on the other hand, I think what is lacking is the will of the local politicians to improve the competitiveness of the country. Why? Because it is unpopular, to restructure the industry or whatever it is, it's much easier to distribute the money to the unemployed and hope to be re-elected.
Hmm.
Is that the scenario which you are sharing, or is that my personal view?
You're absolutely right. Many countries are seeking to improve their competitiveness, and they're also, in different degrees and with different degrees of determination, trying to reform their labour markets. Now, the whole question of competitiveness and reform has to be looked at very carefully. If one understands increased competitiveness as simply being the attempt to push down labour costs through lower wages, through lower social protection, then obviously it's going to meet resistance. People don't like that. But I think the example of the really successful countries in the world, the really competitive countries, and who are they? Look at the World Economic Forum's indices of competitiveness. It's Finland, it's Sweden, it's Denmark, it's also Switzerland. It's not low-wage economies. It's economies which have learnt to cooperate, to bring education, to bring flexible labour markets, but also social protection into play in sophisticated ways. It is not simply a unilateral or unidimensional drive towards low wages and reduced labour costs. I think you will get much greater public support for the types of policies which have this, we would say, high road towards greater competitiveness. I don't say it's easy, but I do think it's the right way to go.
I fully agree with you, but I think there is one issue. What you explained takes time. Re-election is next year.
True. I mean, you're absolutely right. But then you see, you develop, I think, a different style of approach. If you look at some of the countries I've mentioned, they've managed to take this high road. They're also democracies. Governments also change. But there is a consensus in society that this is the right thing to do. And I think that consensus can survive changes of government. So it doesn't become a sort of a electoral competition at the expense of economic success. If that happens, then I think you do have a problem, I agree.
Why are we at the situation right now that we have so many unemployed? Has that to do something with globalization? Has it to do with increased productivity, with tougher competitiveness? What is the reason why we are here? And is there a way out?
Well, many economists point to different factors to explain high levels of unemployment. I think for a very long time, you've had the effects of globalization, which affects some economies more than others because it creates employment opportunities in some countries, but it creates losers in other countries. So you've had globalization. You've had the effect of technological innovation, which is continuing, and I think continues to pose a threat to full employment. But you've also had the crisis, as I've indicated earlier on. The crisis that hit us in 2007 has resulted in the loss of 62 million jobs. We're talking about recovery from crisis now. We're talking about a return to growth. But the ILO's own research shows that if we carry on even the trajectory of recovery that we see today, that jobs gap will increase from 62 million to 75 million. So we need stronger growth. And there's another element which is coming into play. And I just came back from the meetings of the International Monetary Fund in Washington. They're talking about the effects of inequality. Now, we've all recognized, or many of us have, recognized inequality as a social problem. It affects social cohesion. People think that inequality is unfair. They don't like it. And we've seen some interesting initiatives in Switzerland to address inequality in the labour market. The new element is that the IMF and others are identifying high levels of inequality as a problem for economic growth. That is to say, where you have very high levels of inequality, growth tends to be lower. And we're at that stage right now. And the question is, well, why do we have this inequality? One reason is that for now 30 years, wages have not grown as quickly as productivity. Productivity has gone ahead more quickly than the wages that we get. with the result that the share of income going to labour has reduced. This is true across the world, and that affects demand in our economy. So you see today, big companies, multinational companies in Europe, in America, they're sitting on very big piles of money. They have very, very large cash holdings. Why aren't they investing them in job-creating functions? Because they don't see the market. They don't see the market opportunities. It's much easier to place this money in financial assets. And so the stock markets are going through the roof when labour markets, unfortunately, remain very depressed. So I think we need to look at inequality as well.
So I think it's very interesting thing which bothered me, which is we need consumers, and consumers with money,
That's right.
which are willing to pay.
Absolutely.
Does that finally lead to a dislocation of wealth around the world? And how can we do that?
Well, you certainly need those consumers. And for that, you need to get, I think, wages back into line with productivity. We always look at those countries where wages got ahead of productivity, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, with the consequences that we know. But in many more countries, wages got behind productivity. So people don't have the money in their pocket. One of the consequences of that, of course, is before the crisis, people began to borrow a lot of money. We saw in the United States in particular, banks and financial institutions got very good at lending people money, and people wanted to borrow because their wages were not increasing. So to make themselves feel that they could improve their living standards, they borrowed, and they borrowed very unwisely. And the results we saw in 2007 and 2008. So we should be very, very beware of replacing wages, replacing demand through employment with easy money from the financial sector. That gets us into trouble. So we do need to get money back into people's pockets. This is the point. We're talking a lot, and it sounds like a paradox, about the growing middle class around the world in the emerging economies. This is a great dynamic factor in the global economy, and this is true. And we've seen people getting out of poverty and joining the global middle class, but it's a very, very fragile situation. And if the global economy slows down in ways that it could, those people are going to fall backwards, and this global middle class is going to be a very fragile middle class. We need to go forwards, not backwards.
But if we want to create these new customers or consumers, I think globalization, relocation of jobs from rich countries to poor countries, that would be the solution, isn't it?
Look, I've never believed that jobs should stay in one place for all of our lives. The changing division of labour in the global economy, it's natural. It's a natural thing. You know, if we had decided that jobs should stay exactly where they are forever, Sweden, for example, 100 years ago, 90% of Swedes worked in the countryside. They'd still be farmers. Now they're high technology. Now they're service providers. It's a natural part of the evolution of the global economy. The question is not whether jobs will move, it's the conditions under which jobs move. And we think that the natural flow of jobs should be based upon a respect for certain minimum labour standards. The fundamental rights of workers should be respected everywhere. Jobs should not move to places where workers can be subjected to unfair treatment. So I think it's about managing the ebbs and the flows of jobs, not trying to imagine that we can build walls between national economies. I wouldn't agree with that.
That have the unions check that?
I think the international trade union movement understands that. Of course, when a problem arises, when a factory is going to close down in any one country, well, people get very upset. There's a very difficult situation, and it is a job of trade unions to protect their people. But the point is that A, you should manage the processes of change fairly, and secondly, we need to put the growth into place, which means that when one company moves, some sorts of alternatives are available. So it's not a matter of stopping change. I think it's a matter of managing that change.
but that managing the change is not only the responsibility of the enterprises. Enterprises, they say, we have been in Korea, and we have been at the shipyard and so on, and it was closed down, and people were really angry because all the jobs have been moved to the Philippines, and so. So Hanjin, they did that, but who is then looking for the jobs, creating the new jobs, replacing the old ones? Is that also the private sector, or is it the government, or
It's both.
How can we do it?
No, it's both. We now live in a mixed economy globally. You cannot say if a company leaves a country, well, it is the government's responsibility to create new jobs. Of course, governments need to apply policies which help companies to create jobs. And also, the best performing economies, look at Denmark. They have this famous model where they have relatively flexible labour markets, very strong social protection, and very strong assistance to workers who lose their job through training, social protection, public employment services. They push them, or they guide them towards new job opportunities. So I think what you need to see is a very positive, and I have to confess, quite a sophisticated partnership between the private and the public sector. And the bad news is that costs money. Denmark is a high tax economy, but you have to invest in making these systems work. Sometimes people don't like taxes, but if taxes are used properly to provide that type of service, there can be greater acceptance of them.
So what is the role of ILO in its whole context? I think you mentioned government, you mentioned industry. You are here.
Yeah.
The organization responsible for fighting unemployment well.
Yeah. I think we've got to work at two levels. The first level, and I've emphasized it to you already, is that I believe that international cooperation in developing job-creating policies is important. The ILO has a seat at the table of the G20. We provide advice, we provide analysis, we provide ideas to policymakers to help to get growth moving again. I mentioned to you we have a dialogue with the International Monetary Fund, with the World Bank. So we operate within the international system with the other international organizations to help move the global economy forward. But secondly, we work individually with our countries, with our member states. The ILO has 185 member countries around the world, and we work with them to try and help them to design their own policies, their own solutions to this type of problem. And that can look very different depending on the country concerned. If I go to Africa, I can give the example of Africa. Very important year in Africa. The African Union is working towards a major summit in September on jobs and poverty alleviation in Ouagadougou in Burkina. Well, we're working with African countries to say the following. You are growing quickly. Africa is growing very quickly today, about 5.5%, and for a long period of time now. The question is, how can you convert that healthy economic growth into the types of broadly based developments that create jobs? The danger is, and much of this growth, of course, is natural resource based, is that growth is not translated into jobs and progress for people at large. Well, we're working individually and with the African Union to put those types of policies in place. We're working with countries to try and formalize the informal economy, turn these low-quality informal jobs into decent work, into decent jobs, formalized with basic protections. We're putting in place social protection floors around the world, which means that everybody would have a right to minimal social protection, wherever they live, whatever their circumstances. Closer to home, we're working in Greece with the government, but also with our trade union and employer friends. And it's very important for me to underline that the ILO brings together not just governments, but also workers and employers. We're trying to help them to design new policies to help get young people in particular back to work. And there are many more examples I could give you, but it's very practical, very hands-on work. We have to share with our members policies that work, policies that bring results. It's not just theory, very much the practice.
You have also another activity, I think, the annual meeting where you have a lot of unions or almost all unions of each country, the
Yep.
employers of each country
Yep.
are gathering here
That's right.
or wherever. What do you think it will bring to this exchange of know-how, since we have discussed before that finally solutions are mostly national? What is the purpose of this conference?
Yeah, every year, as you're indicating, we have the International Labour Conference here in Geneva. Brings together governments, workers and employers from all of our member states. It's a big gathering. If you're in Geneva in June, you see all these delegates in the Palais des Nations. Well, it depends. Each year we do something sometimes a bit different. Let me tell you what's on the agenda for this June. It gives you an idea. Well, we have an item on formalising the informal economy, precisely what measures it takes to move people from these substandard jobs to the formal sector. That's going to be a big discussion. Sharing experience, sharing knowledge of what works is very important. And then we've got an issue which might surprise you. We've got an issue which is about forced labour and labour trafficking. You know, many people think slavery belongs to the 19th century. Forced labour belongs to yesterday. Well, there are still 21 million people around the world who are subjected to forced labour. And it's a phenomenon which is changing with time. We're seeing people, and it's part of the globalised economy, being moved, trafficked across frontiers to work in highly exploitative conditions. We need to look at new ways to combat a phenomenon which is changing and mutating around the world, which is half invisible. We tend to become aware of it when something terrible happens. So that's the other thing that we are particularly looking at. And then at our conference, there are some things we do every year. We take a look every year at how our member states are applying the conventions, the international labour laws that they have ratified, that they've taken responsibility for. So one of the most animated debates is when countries are asked to explain how they are really applying the conventions they've ratified. That can be quite an interesting experience, and it's worth watching.
Let's come to the labor in general as a value, as an item. I think it was always something very important for men. They were proud doing the work, having the work. Today we are confronted with initiatives like the unconditional basic income or things like that, where you are saying, you know, I do not need to work. Is that the future of work?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on a crucial point. My personal belief, I think the belief of our organisation, is that work, meaningful work, decent work, is fundamental to all of our lives. There is part of your own personal development which is linked to performing intelligent, productive, fulfilling work. I think that was true of my parents' generation, it's true of my generation, and I'm very confident it will be true of my children's generation. So there is something absolutely essential about work and the dignity of work. People say, well, if there's too much welfare, if there are too many alternatives, people won't work. My view is, given the opportunity, people demand work. Our problem is finding opportunities of decent work for most people. You've mentioned, men and women. This is an ambition which is shared by men and women. But the fact of the matter is that many women are outside the labour market. Globally, the participation rate of men is 73%. For women, it's 48%. It's way down. Now, some of this may be by choice, but often women want to find a place in the labour market. They can't find it. And the loss of production from women not being present in labour markets is huge. If we want to get growth going in the global economy, one of the most effective ways of doing it would be to bring women in. So we've got to look at the social policies, childcare, family responsibilities that help women also come into the labour market. And there it's got to do with mentalities and attitudes. Men and women have got to share this responsibility and the benefits.
But isn't this almost impossible at the same time to try to find new job opportunities, to create new jobs. And on the other side, you have productivity increase, you have automation, all these kind of things which are in fact destroying jobs.
It's not. If you ask me,
How can you get out of it?
Well, you can. If you ask me if it's easy, my answer is no. If you ask me if it's impossible, I would say no as well. And we should not have the idea that there are a fixed number of jobs available and they have to be shared out. In fact, if growth takes off, if women are brought into productive employment, this is a self-generating process that can get people into the labour market and get growth moving. This is our history, the history not of the last 5 years, but the last 50 years, the last 100 years. These are development promoting policies which can help, I think, spread prosperity more broadly.
And what about demography?
Demography is another interesting question. And we've got two quite contrasting trends around the world. In Europe, in the industrialized countries, we have aging populations. We're all getting older in Europe and North America, in Japan, even in China, as you know now. Whilst in Africa, well, you've got these young populations. Now, when I travel to Africa, they talk very enthusiastically about the demographic dividend. That is to say, more people are coming into working age, there are fewer pensioners, so in the end, the equation is for social protection and the like is much more favourable. I always say that demographic dividend is a fantastic opportunity, but if you cannot find jobs for these young people, that demographic dividend becomes a demographic time bomb, because if you have large numbers of unemployed youth, you have a problem. You have a problem.
You seem to be quite optimistic about solving the problem of labour. Can you explain why?
Because I think you have to be optimistic. I think you have to be optimistic. I can never understand people who come into policy work and say, well, look, this is terrible, nothing can be done. We have to bring not just optimism, but real determination and a real willingness to cooperate. You know, one of the things that worries me, and I've been in the world of work for many decades, you know, I worry about situations where people no longer have trust in each other. You've mentioned the loss of trust in politicians and governments. That's disturbing. But if you come from the world of work and you know this, where workers and employers begin to lose trust in each other, then you have a problem. You know, the countries that came out best from this crisis, the ones who lost least jobs, I would include Switzerland in this, is where workers and employers know how to talk to each other, where social dialogue is part of the natural way of doing work. This trust matters because if I'm a worker, maybe today I have to make a sacrifice to my employer. Maybe I have to take a couple of percentage less in wages. But if you do that, knowing that when things get better, then you'll get the benefits, you do it. But if you don't trust your employer, you don't make that sacrifice, you don't make that effort. And that limits the capacity of enterprises and our societies to adapt to change, to be resilient to crisis. So, you know, optimism, but let's have that trust. Let's develop that notion that we're in this together and we solve it together. And that's partly the philosophy of the ILO, this organization that brings together governments, employers and workers. Trust, dialogue and common purpose. That's the way to get the job done.
So you think that global wealth will increase?
It will. It will. The question is, I think there are two questions, or three. How quickly it will increase, how fairly we share it, and thirdly, and we haven't talked about this, how we can reconcile that continuing creation of wealth with the ecological future of our planet. You know, we have to be very conscious, and we keep getting warnings about climate change and we keep ignoring them. We have to take those warnings seriously. And I have said very clearly in the ILO that the thing that is really going to distinguish the future of the ILO from the past of the ILO is that we have to now factor in the green part of our work. Our productive system, the system that generates jobs, has got to be compatible with a low carbon future. And I think we're only beginning that discussion, but we have to do it and do it quickly.
So it means that it is not just wealth which makes people happy, it's the total system we're in. And I just read an article yesterday in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. It said the most happy people in the world are the monks.
In Bhutan. Well, maybe we should try that. But it's about the whole system. It's about what makes people happy, but it's got to be sustainable as well. It's got to be sustainable. I think this word sustainability has entered our thinking very, very strongly, but we haven't yet drawn all of the logical conclusions from the need for sustainability: economic, social, and environmental sustainability.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you would like to say a message to my audience,
Well,
future audience.
Well, I think the really important thing is that all of us, and the fact that we're having this conversation is encouraging, begin to think about employment not as a side product of financial policies or economic policies. It's a central objective of our societies. What do we care about? We care about if we've got a decent job. We care about if we've got wages tomorrow. We care about if we earn enough to send the kids to school, to have health care. We worry about if our kids will have a job. So let's put jobs where it belongs, right at the centre of our concerns, the concerns of our politicians, and let's approach the problems with this spirit of cooperation and trust, which I think is essential to get the job done.
I wish you all the best to help the world to achieve this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
May I add one or two things?
I don't know whether you
Yes,
have
of course, of course. No problem.
Because you were talking about this problem or challenge of the inequality. So, and by whom to fight or to address this problem? Because what we saw or what we are seeing is more or less something that might even increase the inequality, like big companies going to time sharing or to outsource jobs to other things, and to reduce labor rights, to reduce the social partnership that puts more insecurity into the labor market. So what can be done and by whom?
Yep. Well, I think the first thing to say, and I saw this very clearly in Washington this week, I think there is a fundamental realignment of thinking. I think for the last 20 years, most policymakers have thought, well, inequality is a worry, it's getting worse, but we have to accept it because that is the price that we pay to make the global economy work better. Somehow the globalization process meant more inequality, and if you want it to work well, you have to accept it. I think that idea is now being replaced by the idea, and it was spoken about very, very openly, that inequality is now a danger to the proper functioning of globalization. So there is an alignment of social and economic concerns. Now, if you think that, then you have to ask the question, what can we do to make inequality come down? And there are several answers to that question. By the way, I think we're only getting to the beginning of the answers. Firstly, taxation. Taxation has become less progressive, both for companies and for individuals. The International Monetary Fund is now talking about the need for more progressive tax systems. I think that's already very important. Secondly, issues like minimum wages and social protection. Many countries are now looking to their minimum wage situations. You know that Germany is going to introduce a minimum wage. This is something quite new. Other countries are re-evaluating their minimum wages. The United States is having a very, very difficult political conversation about a minimum wage. President Obama has proposed a higher minimum wage, but Congress doesn't agree as yet. Social protection systems, providing people with minimum income, which enables them to stay above a certain floor. All of these things can be done. But if you look at the world of work, I also attach great importance to collective bargaining. How do workers generally claim a fair share of production? By bargaining with employers. Now, in many countries, the power of unions to do that has been somewhat reduced. I think we need to start promoting collective bargaining again. A new government in Chile just came in, Madame Bachelet. Part of her program is to promote trade unions, promote collective bargaining. So these are all parts of the policies. But it's a complex story, and I agree with you. We have to look sometimes at the behaviour of corporations, at multinational companies. But we need to turn that corner. And what I find is very encouraging is many countries are looking at this. China is worried about inequality and acting on it. Brazil is looking at inequality and acting upon it. So there's a combination of things that we can be done. The starting point is to agree inequality is a problem, not something we have to live with, but something we have to cure.
Everything you just said is all sums up to the observation that it's in the hands of the politicians or on the political side. So you have to come with minimum wages. You have to maybe have strong unions, like the workers bargain for their rights or for their fair share, as you say. But on the hand of the economy, where a lot of the power is, not much will be done or can be done, because they might see the problem, but it's not in their interest to address it, because it's also about profits and this and that. So how can the political side be strong enough to face the economy who might have different interests?
Well, I don't think you need to make that total differentiation between the private and the public. The public sector is there to regulate the market. If we leave things to the market, you will get the results that the market produces. I've talked about the need to manage economic processes. I see the role of the government, individually and collectively as well, is to handle the private economy, to manage the private sector in a way which produces outcomes that we all want. So I don't think you need to make a sort of a big distinction between the private economy over here and government over there. It's the way they interact in mixed economic systems. And there are many ways that works well. We're seeing the way the international community now is tackling tax questions. We're seeing the way that they're dealing with social protection systems. The two interact and produce results. It's always been like that. It's always been like that. Now, of course, there's a lot of financial power out there in the financial sector, in the banking sector, in private corporations. Governments have to tackle those problems, and people have to express how they want them to do it.
And there's a competition between different countries to allocate the economy, to say, okay, here you don't have minimum wages, come to us. So it's like the countries have to team up also to address this problem.
Well, I think every country has an advantage in the end of avoiding a mutually damaging race to the bottom. You're right, countries can compete on low wages, on poor labour conditions, and that has happened in history. But as I said earlier on, I think the real way forward is actually to increase labour standards. Take the garment industry. This is a globalised industry. We're looking to work with developing countries where this garment industry is very important. You know, later this month we'll be marking the anniversary of the tragedy in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza factory collapse. 1,100 people lost their lives there. We're working to improve conditions in that sector, the ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh. Minimum wages, since that disaster, minimum wages have gone up very considerably. They were at, I think, $38 a month, can you imagine? Today they're over $70 a month. We're making workplaces safe. We're making sure that factories are safe. We're changing legislation with our Bangladeshi colleagues. You know, we've got to move up the floors, not move them down so we can compete better. And I think that logic can work.
You were talking about, last question, you were talking about forced labor also. And when we were in Korea, we were also thinking also to go to North Korea and have a look at the system over there. And you have the special economic zones, some like Kaesong.
Yep.
And it's interesting that, you know, here in the media, like always North Korea is the bad boy, but also the West or our companies or our economies accept to use cheap labor over there for their own production. What's your opinion or your view of this?
I have to say straight away that North Korea is not a member of the ILO. It's one of those countries outside the ILO.
But a lot of the members produce over there in
Well, there's a limited amount in North Korea, but it's not a country. I have to be very honest, where I have any particular knowledge or comment to make because it's outside. But you know, I think you're right. In general, today we have global supply chains across the world. It makes less and less sense to say this product is German, or this product is Swiss, or this product is Indian. This product is all of those things. And we have to look, I think, more and more about how these global supply chains work and holding people responsible, whether it's nation states or whether it's private companies, for the conditions along a supply chain. This is one of the things we're beginning to work at the ILO. We'll be having a big discussion on global supply chains in the future. I think in a globalized economy, it makes less and less sense to look at this country, or that country individually. We've got to look at the transversal production links. And that leads us into new territory for the ILO, but we need to do it.
Thank you very much.
We were in South Korea,
Yeah.
and we met with a North Korean young guy.
Yeah. What did he say?
I think this is one of the most entrepreneurial guys
I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've never been there, and I have very little knowledge of it. But I know, of course, the industrial zone on the border there.
No, we haven't been.
You didn't go there,
get there.
but you
Well,
talked
there
to.
are 3 already,
Yeah.
more and more. So.
Yeah.
But
But it's a fascinating story. I understand
it
it.
is.
the government first, the embassy told me, yes, you can go, and so can
Yeah.
go. So,
Yeah.
and then it was delayed and
Yeah.
delayed.
You couldn't
and
go. Yeah.
delayed. And finally, I found out that they were waiting for money from me,
Is that right?
and I said, no way. So I escaped.
They wanted money. Strange country.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Real
Very
pleasure.
interesting.
Well, thanks for coming. Make sure you get your microphone back.
I'm sure you have a collection of those.
Yes, I keep them when I can.
Thank you very much. It was a great interview.
Take your time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Really a
Yes,
pleasure.
yes, a real
And
pleasure.
come back when you made your film and we'll look at it.
Yes.
When will it be ready?